make me look like I have a brick in my pocket, and tiny flat ones that can barely hold anything. Nothing has ever felt right. That is until I tried the Extra wallet. I've been using the Extra wallet for a couple months now, and I can honestly say it's the best and most well thought out wallet I've ever used. I'm not exaggerating. It's got a few easy access pockets for my frequently used cards, and also this neat little interior card holder to store all of my cards that I don't use as often, which also doubles as a fidget toy with a satisfying button. The Extra wallet somehow manages to do all of this while still being surprisingly small. But if I want something even smaller, then you'll see me with my tiny Extra Card Holder Pro, which can hold up to 14 cards and a wad of cash in its cash strap. I barely even notice that this thing is in my pocket, but I'm also not worried about losing it because I've also got Extra's Finder card, which is the world's slimmest waterproof Apple Find My card. All I've got to do is load up the Find My app, and I can see exactly where my wallet is. Extra is currently running an anniversary sale until March 31st, and they're offering discounts up to 30% off. But if you go to partner.extra.com/feral and use code feral, you'll get an extra 10% off, making it an even 40. Thanks to Extra for sponsoring this video. The following video was uploaded in September 2021. The title describes a broadcast hijacking of a local Russian news channel, which apparently aired something called Kingdom of Heaven. The video starts with some backstory to the incident. The uploader says that they discovered an archival recording of a Kingdom of Heaven segment from their hometown in the early 90s, which was previously considered lost. Although the segment had aired before they were born, it still seemed oddly familiar to them. They decide to show it to their parents, who said that they might have a recording of the original segment on a VHS tape somewhere in the basement. The OP grabs the tapes from their house and gives them to a friend to digitize. And lo and behold, the Kingdom of Heaven segment was on one of them. According to the OP's parents, the recording would have been made sometime between 2003 and 2006. This is what it showed. As you can see, this broadcast hijacking appears to show us some eerie televised obituaries, the first one being for an infant named Vera. There's a number of hidden and bizarre things about this clip. After the screen of text describing Vera's death, some static begins to fade in, and some picture of a man wearing a medical mask appears to just barely peek through the noise. And on top of that, just for a brief moment, we get another screen of text that we can just barely make out. This one reads,
"After several days of searching, Vera was found when neighbors began complaining about a strong odor coming from a clogged garbage chute. The body was discovered among the layers of moldy garbage."
We get more of that incomprehensible staticky mess. And again, another hidden screen of text that just barely comes through over the noise.
"The cause of death was determined to be blood loss due to laryngeal hemorrhage. Small fragments of crystal glassware and remains of semolina porridge were found in the stomach."
Semolina porridge is a popular baby food in Russia. And also, obituaries don't usually go into such detail as to how a person died. In the second obituary, it almost seems like a piece of text is missing. And that's because part of the story is almost unreadable due to wild tracking and noise. This one reads,
"On the evening of the unfortunate day, upon her husband's return home, Svetlana took the car and left in an unknown direction. Soon after, her husband discovered that their daughter, money, and his wife's documents were all missing."
After this, we get a kind testimonial, presumably from the husband, saying that they'll meet again in heaven. But instead of the "we remember, we love, we grieve" post-text like we get in the first obit, this one instead eerily says,
"I hope you die, bitch."
After this, the local news seems to fade back in, and that's when the tape ends. According to the OP, his parents had originally planned to record a news segment filmed at his school that he might have appeared in. His parents thought that the hijacking was probably just some sort of malfunction, either with the TV or the news station. OP back then, merely just a child, was slightly frightened by the hijacking, but luckily didn't read the inscriptions too closely, and his parents didn't let him watch the recording after. According to the OP, no information about this hijacking can be found anywhere. Not on the internet, and not in any sort of local news archives. He ends the video by asking if anyone has any more information. This video is completely earnestly presented. Nowhere does the uploader give any sort of indication that what we're watching is a work of fiction. And, in fact, these Kingdom of Heaven obituaries were supposedly a real thing in Russia in the 90s. As much as it might look like analog horror, these obituaries would apparently sometimes air between TV shows in early post-Soviet Union Russia. The one you're watching right now is supposedly real, and the text here is much more normal for an obituary and isn't describing the violent circumstances of someone's death. This is just so eerie and ominous. The cheaply recorded orchestra, the monotone palette, the way the music cuts off abruptly and the bells play, I honestly can't believe that what we're watching isn't someone's analog horror project. Most of these Kingdom of Heaven segments are considered lost media. According to a Russian page on the Lost Media Wiki, there were supposedly up to 150 segments made in total between 1991 and 1994. What's interesting here is that while we have many recordings of these supposed obituaries, none of them have ever actually been confirmed to be real, and many of them have actually been proven to be fabricated. And the fact that the first mention of this even existing being in an ImageWare post from 2017 is also pretty suspicious. While some commenters say that either them or their parents do remember televised obituaries appearing on Russian TV in the 90s, nobody seems to have any proof of this, and the network that supposedly aired these segments has denied their existence as well. And by the way, that supposedly real segment we just watched, a Russian YouTuber recently confirmed that it was fabricated, which kinda leads me to believe that everything here is fake, even though it's listed on Wikipedia. I will say though that if these are all actually fake, they are still incredibly well done. These videos actually look like they were legitimately recorded on tape. This is really a step above the average VHS effects you typically see in analog horror. And apparently, like every other Russian horror thing we cover, Kingdom of Heaven also became a meme format that people have already turned into shitposts. I'm still curious though. If you're Russian, do you think that there's any chance of something like this legitimately existing? Let me know in the comments. Alright, we're gonna move on from a probably fake creepy classic TV thing to something very real. One thing I find interesting on the internet are the communities that have developed specifically around old home video logo bumpers. like those short little 2-second clips with the production company's logo you'll see before your DVD or VHS gets to the main feature. There are communities completely centered around compiling, telling the history, and even remixing these old home video logo bumpers. Some of these videos have millions of views. One common aspect you'll notice in the logos community is the idea that some of these logos are scary, which I guess I don't really understand personally. I'm guessing it has something to do with childhood memories of being freaked out by them, but regardless, horror seems to play a fairly big part in this strange niche, and a lot of these logo remixes seem to revolve around making a logo bumper scarier. There is one logo though that I do find pretty uncanny, and of course it's Russian.
With the YouTube music app, you can discover remix after remix after remix after remix. Ooh, I love that house version. Try 1 month free.
Yeah, if I saw this as a kid, it would definitely freak me out. The statue head looks like something you would either find in some ancient Chinese tomb or some horror claymation movie. The music also seems really out of place for a logo bumper like this. It sounds more like the sort of thing you would hear before a battle starts in a turn-based RPG game. The logo is for a Russian television company called Vid, which has been around since 1987. The logo, being as striking as it is, must have been a major success for the company because no matter what article about Vid I read, there was always a lengthy section just about the logo bumper. The logo was created by Andrei Raspash, and he based the face off of a ceramic sculpture of Chinese philosopher Guo Xiang that featured a 3-legged toad on top of his head. This sculpture is owned by the Museum of Oriental Art in Moscow, and apparently they tried to sue the production company over their usage of the sculpture, so Andre and his team had to digitally alter the features of the statue to make it look different enough from the original sculpture, which I suppose had a hand in making it look as uncanny as it
Welcome
does.
to the Journeyman's Fate channel.
The logo was basically immediately seen as frightening and off-putting. The company quickly began receiving many complaints from the parents of scared children, so over the years, they've had to continually alter the logo to make it look less creepy. Of course, this logo is a pretty big Russian meme nowadays. You can find countless parodies and remixes on YouTube, and interestingly enough, it seems to have found its way into the Western logo community as well, with many prominent logo YouTubers making videos about it, which I guess might lead one to think that the logo community is not only based around nostalgia. And thus concludes today's brief walk through the seemingly endless trail that is Russian internet horror. We'll definitely be returning soon enough for a third part, because there's still a ton out there that we haven't covered yet. I think for part 3 I might look at some more mysteries rather than just horror fiction, but if you guys have any suggestions, please leave them below. I read every comment on my last video, and I'll read every comment here as well. And if you're still watching this far into the video, maybe consider subscribing. And if you want to support the channel, we just launched a Patreon last month where you'll find some exclusive content. Alright guys, spokojnej noci.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over one of the most disturbing and tragic cases ever featured on the channel. And the second one is equally strange, but for different reasons. Although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. The building at 5635 Clemens Avenue was a forgotten skeletal ruin of brick tucked into a quiet corner of North St. Louis. It had long since been abandoned and left to rot like others alongside it, and so it crumbled and was reclaimed by time and nature. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of 2 trespassers on the afternoon of February 28, 1983. Around 3:30 p.m., two men entered the building's basement looking for a piece of pipe. They weren't expecting to find much, just scrap metal or something useful, but instead they stumbled into a nightmare. The furnace room was pitch black with the kind of darkness that swallowed everything it surrounded when one of the men flicked his lighter on. This small flame barely cut through the darkness, but either way, they immediately saw the outline of what appeared to be a small body lying face down on the cold concrete floor. Initially unsure whether their eyes were playing tricks on them, they moved in closer to get a better look, but it only confirmed what they had initially seen. The body appeared to belong to a young woman whose hands had been bound behind her back with rough fibers of what looked to be a jump rope digging into her wrists. The sweater she wore, which was a yellow v-neck, was also blood-stained, and its tags were removed as if someone had deliberately erased any trace of where it came from. Then, from the waist down, she had no clothes, but more horrifyingly, from the neck up, she was headless. The small lighter flame then went out, and the two men ran stumbling out of the building and into the daylight to find a payphone to call police. By the time authorities arrived minutes later, the scene had already settled back into the same pitch blackness that concealed the scene so brutal that it left even seasoned detectives shaken. At first, some officers assumed that she must have been an adult night worker or an addict, but when they moved the body, an even more disturbing reality set in. The girl was likely young, no older than 10 at first estimate, and later revised to be somewhere between 8 and 11 years old. She was also black, tall for her age, and completely unrecognizable. And with no head, no identification, and no immediate reports of a missing child that fit her description, she was a complete mystery. Investigators then searched the basement for the missing piece, but found nothing. If the killer had left it behind, it was well hidden. More than likely, however, they had taken it with them. One detective, hardened by years of seeing crimes up close, said later that it looked precise and like maybe the person was even familiar with anatomy. Another detective even called it the worst he had ever seen in his 20 years investigating homicides. There was also hardly any blood around her body, leading police to believe that this wasn't the scene of her murder and that the building was just a dumping ground. It seemed that someone had brought her to this dark, forgotten corner of the city and left her discarded like trash. And since she had no name, one was assigned to her, at least one that could be written on reports. Some called her Little Jane Doe and others called her Hope, but tragically, no one called to claim her. Police were quickly in the aftermath, but in the early hours of their investigation, one thing became clear: this little girl didn't seem to exist. By that night, detectives had canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and speaking to residents. Someone just had to be missing a child, and someone had to be looking for her, but it appeared that no one was. Not a single call came in reporting a little girl missing. The officers then turned to missing persons reports, hoping for a match, but again came up with nothing. Of the roughly 20 missing children in St. Louis at the time, no one fit her description. It was as if she never belonged to anyone, so by the next morning, a new theory began to take shape. Maybe she wasn't from St. Louis at all. If she had been reported missing, it hadn't been in Missouri at least. Investigators then expanded their search, considering that her killer may have brought her in from another state, knowing that she wouldn't be immediately missed. Police then checked schools in the area for students who had withdrawn or transferred around the time of her death, but the results were frustratingly empty. Whoever she had been and whatever life she had known, there was no trace of it there. The scene itself offered little evidence too. Her yellow sweater was newly purchased, and with the tags intentionally removed, the message police received was that someone didn't want this item traced. The sweater could have been bought in any number of places, which suggested that this wasn't some random act of violence. Instead, it was deliberate, careful, and methodical. Then on top of that, there was a lack of blood. An incident as brutal as this should have left pooling and splatters around the area where she was found, but instead, there were only small streaks along the walls, as if someone had carried her body in and brushed it up against them. And the cause of death wasn't immediately clear either. With a key piece of evidence missing, it was difficult to determine with any kind of certainty. What they could tell, though, was that the wound was clean, as if it was done by a very sharp, long-bladed knife. It also didn't appear rushed or messy, like someone had taken their time, and it likely took place elsewhere. An autopsy then revealed that her stomach was empty, suggesting she hadn't eaten for some time before she was killed. This led to questions about if she was being held somewhere else or if she was afraid to eat. But weirdly, there were also no broken bones, no scars, and no other signs of physicality either. So if she had been kidnapped, it seems she hadn't suffered any prolonged treatment. The FBI's behavioral science unit was then brought in to help answer these questions and more, but without knowing the girl's identity, they had little to work with. The usual methods like psychological profile, looking into the victim's life, and tracking their last movements were all useless. They simply had no starting point. And the case only became more of a mystery as time went on. Police speculated that she had been killed by someone familiar with the area, like a local, or at least someone who knew how to hide a body in a building no one would check. Maybe it was someone she trusted, or someone she had known, at least for a short time. Some investigators thought this was the case, pointing out that removing a head was often personal. On the other hand, it could have been someone who didn't want her identified, or it could have been something far worse, like a ritualistic act performed by a serial offender. But in any case, she was taken to the morgue with no fresh leads, no urgent tips, and no family members rushing forward in desperation to find her. The case of Little Jane Doe quickly became one of the most frustrating and haunting unsolved crimes in St. Louis history. For weeks after the discovery of the body, detectives combed the city searching for any clue that might reveal who she was. They visited schools, checked social services, and reviewed medical records, but no matter how hard they tried, detectives were left with nothing. The brutal nature of it suggested something deeply personal or deeply depraved, yet despite the horror of the case, still no one had come forward to claim her. As the year dragged on with no fresh leads and no avenue to pursue, police had to make a tough decision. 10 months after her body was discovered, they allowed her to be laid to rest. It was December 1983, and the funeral ceremony was a somber one. No parents stood at her grave, no relatives wept, and no memories of happier times with the victim were shared. The only ones present were those who had tried and thus far failed to find her name. Over the years afterward, only one suspect will come to stand out. A man named Vernon Brown was a convicted murderer and a serial predator with an MO chillingly similar to the St. Louis Jane Doe case. In 1986, 3 years after her body was found, Vernon lured a 9-year-old into his home, tied her up, and finished her off with a rope. Then, just a year prior, he had done the same thing to another 19-year-old woman. And of note, both victims were also young, black, and vulnerable. So police wondered if Little Jane Doe could have been one of his earlier victims. This theory then gained traction when investigators realized that Vernon had lived in St. Louis at the time of the little girl's murder. And then on top of that, he was obviously both familiar with the city and capable of extreme brutality. One glaring difference stood in the way of definitively tying him to the murder though, which was that he never removed any other part of his victims. So, even as he sat on death row and investigators pressed him for answers, Vernon never confessed to Little Jane Doe's murder. And if he had killed her, he took the truth with him. On May 18, 2005, Vernon received the death penalty. For 30 years, the case remained frozen in time with no new leads or suspects and nothing further on Little Jane Doe's identity. To make things worse, when she'd been buried, the burial took place at Washington Park Cemetery, which was a cheap, rundown graveyard that had been left to neglect and decay. The cemetery was in complete disrepair, overgrown with weeds, and with its records incomplete. So just as she had been in life, it seemed she had been forgotten in death. And this was of the utmost importance in 2013 as investigators saw a glimmer of hope in the potential of DNA testing. If her bones held traces of minerals from the water and food she consumed, scientists could determine where regionally she had lived most of her life. There was a big problem though. When investigators arrived at the Washington Park Cemetery, they couldn't find her grave. At some point over the years, her burial records had been lost or misplaced. The cemetery had also deteriorated so much since her burial that her remains weren't where they thought they should be. And police obviously couldn't just go digging up every grave in the cemetery, but in a rare stroke of luck in the case, they wouldn't have to. A 23-year-old researcher named Abby from Washington University took it upon herself to solve the problem. Using old newspaper footage from the funeral and satellite images from the U.S. Geological Survey, Abby was able to pinpoint the correct location of the grave. Once the girl's remains were exhumed, scientists began conducting the tests, and results became available for police to review. The isotopic analysis then revealed that the little girl had likely spent her entire life in the southeastern United States, in one of 10 states the results listed. This was the first real clue about where she had come from, but still, there were no missing person reports, DNA matches in any databases, or records to suggest who she was. So, even with science providing new leads, she remained unidentified and still does to this day. After her body was examined, Little Jane Doe was laid to rest again, but this time at a different cemetery in a section designated for unidentified and abandoned children. Her case still lingers in the cold case files of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department.
สารอาหารครบเสริมด้วยดูแม็กซ์ดูโก UST มีวิตามินและแร่ธาตุถึง 15 ชนิด อะไร
Whether we pay close attention or not, the concept of coincidence is something we all experience in some form or fashion pretty regularly. Defined as a striking occurrence of two or more events at one time, apparently by mere chance, coincidences could sometimes be so subtle that we may not even notice them. Other instances, however, can drive us to question everything we know about the world we live in. This is the simplest answer when reality twists itself into something too unsettling to ignore. Like, for example, maybe you think about a friend you haven't talked to in a while, only for that person to suddenly and unexpectedly reach out. Or maybe you go on vacation hundreds of miles from home and run into someone you know. Coincidence allows us to explain away the impossible and convince ourselves that life is nothing more than a collection of random, unconnected moments. And most of the time, these explanations are enough. But every so often, a pattern emerges that refuses to be dismissed so easily, and coincidence becomes something much more. Erdington is a quiet suburb of Birmingham, England, and is not exactly the type of place you might expect to be at the center of a historical coincidence so profound that it still hangs over the community after more than 200 years. It was once just a rural village and became a convenient stop for travelers going between Chester and London in the 18th and 19th centuries. The morning of May 27, 1817 was a day that began like any other in Erdington. The sun rose over the fields, the air was crisp, and the town's laborers set out for another day of work. As one man made his way across a familiar stretch of land, however, something unusual caught his eye. Near a pit filled with water lay a bundle of clothing, a hat, and a single woman's shoe stained with blood. Alarmed by this, he called for help, and soon locals gathered to investigate. Together, they dragged the pit with rakes, and within moments, their worst fears were realized. The body of Mary Ashford emerged from the dark pool, her arms bruised and her dress torn, which were the unmistakable signs of an assault before her death. Mary had spent the last evening of her life in celebration. At 20 years old, she was a woman with many admirers and was known for her kindness and beauty. She worked as a housekeeper for her uncle, a farmer in Langley Heath, and spent her days tending to domestic tasks. The day before, so on May 26, was a holiday known as Whit Monday, and the annual feast and dance at a local pub known as the Tyburn House was an event that drew people from all over. Mary had arranged to attend the event with her friend Hannah, and earlier that day she stopped by Hannah's home to drop off a fresh set of clothes for the night ahead. After finishing her work, Mary returned to Hannah's place, changed into her party dress, and by 7:30 p.m. the two friends arrived at the pub, eager to join the festivities already underway. The dance afterward was lively, and Mary quickly caught the attention of a 24-year-old man from Castle Bromwich named Abraham Thornton. He was a man that split opinions, with some describing him as handsome, while others found him coarse and unappealing. What was clear, though, was that he had a strong interest in Mary. According to one account, he made a bold claim to another partygoer that evening, boasting that he had already been intimate with Mary's sister and would soon be intimate with Mary as well. Whether or not he said those words, what is known is that he was particularly attentive to Mary throughout the night. And Mary, for her part, didn't seem to mind his company, and as the evening wore down, she prepared to leave with him. At midnight, Mary, Hannah, Abraham, and another young man, Benjamin, left the dance together. They walked along Chester Road until the group splintered, with Hannah returning home, Benjamin returned to the dance, and Mary continuing on with Abraham. Around 2:45 that morning, a laborer saw Abraham and a woman walking together along the road. He greeted them, but the woman kept her head down. Then at 4 a.m., Mary arrived back at Hannah's home to change out of her dress and into her work clothes. And when she arrived, she seemed calm, even cheerful. Hannah, curious about Mary's whereabouts, asked where she had been, to which Mary replied that she had spent time with Abraham, but that he had left some time ago. She then gathered her belongings, explained that she needed to hurry because her uncle would be leaving for the market soon, and then she stepped out into the night. This was the last time Hannah would see her alive. By 8 a.m., just a few hours later, the town was in chaos. Two factory workers retracing Mary's likely path discovered fresh footprints in the newly harrowed field near the pit. And there were two sets, one belonging to a woman and the other to a man. These tracks led up to the edge of the water, but there was only one set of footprints that led away from the pit, and the implication was obvious. So soon after, authorities arrested Abraham. He then admitted to spending the evening with Mary and even claimed that they had been intimate in a field before parting ways. When questioned further, though, he insisted their encounter had been entirely consensual, but the evidence against him mounted quickly. Abraham's shoes just so happened to match the footprints leading to the pit, and bloodstains were found on his clothing. The post-mortem examination on Mary then revealed some more disturbing details, which were that Mary had died by drowning and her body bore signs of an attack. Erdington then erupted in outrage. Abraham's trial began on August 8, 1817, with the full weight of public condemnation pressing down on the courtroom. So although the law required impartiality, much of Erdington had already made up its mind that Abraham was a murderer. Pamphlets circulated through town and poems were written, each touting his guilt before the trial even began. The courtroom also filled to capacity before the proceedings even started, with spectators eager to see justice delivered to a young woman found dead in the pit. And from the outset, the prosecution laid out a damning case. Abraham had admitted to being with Mary that night, and his shoes matched the footprints found at the scene, linking him to the murder in the minds of many. As the trial progressed, however, cracks began to form in the case against him. Abraham actually had an alibi supported by several witnesses. At 4:30 a.m., around the time Mary had been killed, a milkman claimed to have seen Abraham walking calmly near a local farm 2.5 miles from the pit. Then not long after, at 4:50 a.m., a gamekeeper testified that he had seen Abraham and even stopped to talk with him for about 15 minutes. If these witnesses were to be believed, then Abraham would have had to commit the crime, dispose of her body, then somehow travel nearly 3 miles in the span of at most 11 minutes. and the sheer impossibility of this began to unravel the prosecution's case. In fact, by the time the jury was sent to deliberate at the end of the one-day trial, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted. Despite the outcry from the townspeople, the evidence against Abraham was circumstantial at best. His encounter with Mary, while deeply unsettling, was not in itself proof of murder. The footprints in the field only showed that he had walked with her, not that he had harmed her. And the bloodstains on his clothing, while suspicious, were also explainable given the intimate encounter he had admitted to. At the autopsy, the medical examiner apparently determined that Mary had not been with a man before the encounter and she was menstruating at the time of her death, which could have explained the blood found on Abraham's clothing. So after everything, the jury deliberated for only 6 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. This decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Many had expected a conviction, but instead, Abraham was free to go. But Mary's family, understandably, was not willing to accept the verdict. Her brother William immediately appealed the decision, invoking a rare and ancient legal right, which is his right to a second trial through an appeal of murder. But Abraham, rather than accept another trial, responded with an even older legal loophole, something known as a trial by battle. In an astonishing moment that left the courtroom in stunned silence, Abraham stood before the court, removed a leather glove, and threw it onto the floor. This meant he was challenging William to a fight to the death. This was actually a legally sanctioned duel to prove his innocence before God, and the challenge was not just symbolic. Trial by battle was a Norman-era law, still technically legal in Britain, although it hadn't been invoked in centuries. If William accepted, he and Abraham would be armed with weapons and forced to fight until one of them either died or surrendered, at which point the loser would be declared guilty and the victor would walk free. The concept was obviously a relic of medieval justice, but the court had no choice but to acknowledge its validity. And Abraham was a broad, stocky man, far stronger than William. He stood confidently, waiting for William to pick up the glove, but William never did. Whether out of fear or principle, he refused to engage in a fight to the death. So, without an opponent, Abraham's challenge went unanswered, and in the eyes of the law, the case was dismissed. But while legally the matter was settled, in the court of public opinion, Abraham would never be free. The people of Erdington still believed he was Mary's murderer. Wherever he went, he was met with hostility, whispers behind his back, and suspicion weighing on him. So within a few years, he fled England for the United States, disappearing into history, leaving only the mystery of what really happened that night behind him. Mary's murder remained unsolved, but the tragedy faded into the past. History, however, has a way of repeating itself. 157 years later, on the very same date, in the very same place, the town would be rocked by a murder so eerily similar that it would seem almost impossible to be just a coincidence. On the night of May 26, 1974, Barbara Forrest was a 20-year-old, and she was known for her kindness, devout faith, and commitment to her job as a nurse at Pipe Hayes Children's Home in Erdington. She was deeply involved in St. Mark's Lutheran Church, where she served as a national secretary for the youth group. And by all accounts, she was a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. But just like Mary over a century and a half before her, Barbara was about to become part of a mystery that still defies explanation. That evening, Barbara and her boyfriend Simon had gone out dancing. They visited a few local bars, laughing and enjoying themselves late into the night. At just after 1 a.m., Simon walked her to a bus stop so she could head home. This was the last time he saw her, and Barbara never did make it home that night. When she didn't show up for work at the children's home on May 27th, concern spread quickly. She was responsible and never wanted to disappear without a word. So police search was launched almost immediately, and given Barbara's clean-cut reputation, authorities wasted no time treating her case like a potential crime. With each passing hour, the fear that something terrible had happened grew stronger, but it would take days before the grim discovery was made. On June 4th, Barbara's body was discovered in a park just a